I want to talk to you about people. Not kids or adults, not specifically, at least. I mean just people. Everyone, humans, if you want to be specific about it. We get really good at separation, us people, and the times we're best at it is when it comes to ourselves. We separate ourselves by gender or age, maybe race, maybe something less tangible like wealth or belief. It doesn't have to be huge or aggressive or noticeable at all, really, for it to be true. We like seeing the differences between ourselves. At the end of the day, though, it doesn't really matter. We're all pretty alike in the ways that count, and I don't mean it in a feel-good optimism kind of way. I mean that we all share a darkness, a creature. I mentioned it in the intro to the first video, but I don't think I ever really clarified what I meant at the time, or maybe I only implied it. I've tried to separate these videos, one about adults and the other about kids, the first one for mono and the second for six, but it's been foolish, really. If you take a step back and look at it, really take in the salty air and the sounds of distant chimes, the truth we've been amping up to reveals itself, the puzzle I keep mentioning finally coming together, at least in one way. It's a simple observation, really, one that's so obvious it almost feels like a joke to hype it up like this. Here it is. It doesn't matter how old we are, what power we hold, what reason we give for the strange actions we take. The truth is, we are all about the same in one undeniable way. We are all terrible. Today's video is sponsored by Manta Sleep. As someone who spends all day writing, recording, and editing at my computer, when I go to sleep, I need a break from all the lights and LEDs. Unfortunately, with my ADHD, even the smallest bit of light can be super distracting and interrupt my sleep. That's why I use Manta, and I really mean that. Before Manta even reached out to me for a sponsorship, I'd been using their original sleep mask for years. The mask is super comfortable and blocks out light better than any mask I've ever tried. The eye coverings are comfortably shaped and adjustable, so your sleep isn't interrupted. I really enjoyed my original mask, but the folks at Manta hooked me up with an upgrade and sent me the Bluetooth-connected Sleep Mask Sound, which is super comfortable, but the best part is that it has 2 adjustable Bluetooth speakers built in that can be positioned comfortably over your ears while you sleep. It's great for planes, shared rooms, or trying to do guided meditation with zero distraction. I really love my masks, and I'm certain you will too. If you follow the link in my description and use the code BONEHEAD at checkout, you'll get 10% off of your order. It's a great way to support the channel and an even better way to get a good night's sleep. Gotta recover from the horror somehow, right? As Six walked up that long staircase out of the maw and into the light, a bunch of those little pointy-hatted creatures, the gnomes, watched her go. You remember the gnomes, right? 681? Yeah, you remember. I think we've learned by now that trying to guess what exactly is going on in the head of any character in this universe is a fool's errand, so realistically, we have no idea how the gnomes gathered at the base of the stairs feel about the events that recently transpired. Do they know that the lady is dead? Do they care? Are they even capable of enough thought to recognize that a change has occurred at all? And if so, how do they feel about Six eating one of them? Is that why they don't follow her up? There are many questions, and if you stop playing Little Nightmares where I stopped talking about it in the last video, most of them will remain unanswered. However, if you're a super sleuth like me, you may notice there's a DLC for the game. You might call it The Secrets of the Maw, and you might call it that because that's the DLC's name, but I prefer to refer to it by its real title. Gnome Quest 2017! Gnome Quest 2017. The 2017 is there because the game came out in 2017. It's called Gnome Quest because it's a quest about gnomes. But all joking aside, the Little Nightmares DLC gives some really interesting context and insight to the rest of the series. There are a lot of minor details hidden throughout the side story that are worth mentioning. I don't have a theory for all of them, but sometimes you can just tell when something is relevant, even if you don't specifically know why. It's not really necessary to go through the DLC with the same hyper-focus that we analyzed the mainline games through, so I'll only be mentioning the essential moments that happen in my summary, unless there's a specific detail that adds to what we've already been talking about. But before we do that, I think we should go back to Six's last interaction with the gnomes. You know, the time where she ate one? As per usual, the way that people interpret that scene is incredibly varied and nuanced. Obviously, I hyperbolically interpreted it one way in my analysis. What the fuck is this scene then? But plenty of people see it in a different, more forgiving way. As mentioned in the last video, we're pretty certain by this point, as is likely Six, that the meat being served in the maw is human meat, and probably mostly children. So when the gnome holds the meat out to Six, it's possible, in a starved delirium, that she chooses to eat him because she's disgusted by the alternative. Now, I think this is an ethically dubious choice, as she's actively choosing to kill something instead of eating what's already dead. It's kind of the weirdest trolley problem I've encountered in a while, and that's why I prefer another theory. But it's one we'll talk about later. For now, let's focus on a specific line I included in the last video. Eating another person is pretty morally black and white, and yes, the gnomes are people. The DLC proves this. Now yes, obviously Six didn't know that this gnome was a person. Probably, hopefully, but the main takeaway I want you to have is that, like everything in this place, there's a reason that the gnomes are here. Usually we have to make peace with not knowing that reason, but Gnome Quest, as I am going to continue to call it, throws us a bone. Gnome Quest also begins with a vision. But interestingly, this seems to be the only vision that doesn't give any warning about the game's conclusion. Mono's vision in Little Nightmares 2 was of the door that he would eventually be trapped behind by the game's end, and Six's vision in the first game was of the lady who she'd go on to consume. The vision of this new character, a person known as the Runaway Kid, is of himself treading water for a moment before he's pulled beneath the surface of the water, and wakes with a jolt in a rather familiar location. We'll find out shortly that this vision really only resembles the contents of the first chapter of this DLC, so after that point, we're operating almost completely in the dark. At least in character. The place we wake up is that nursery where we first encountered the janitor as Six in the main game. It appears that this DLC takes place during approximately the same time as Little Nightmares, and in fact, we even get to see a brief glimpse of Six during our playthrough, as she passes through the shoe room we discussed in the last video. And a note about that. In the last video, I implied that the shoes here all belonged to the children being slaughtered for the feast, but as some of you correctly pointed out, many of the shoes appear to be bigger than any child would wear, raising the question again of who could they have belonged to? Are they the shoes of the guests? Are the guests also being killed? What other reason might there be for them leaving shoes behind? This universe is confusing sometimes, a lot of the time, most of the time. The kid sees a little girl with a flashlight in the distance. She has no interest in communicating with us in a way that is very reminiscent of Six's behavior, but things go a lot worse for her than they normally do for Six. As we follow her through these first couple stages, it becomes clear to us that the path we're taking is opposite to the path that Six will take during her introduction. In fact, the girl that you're following lowers and climbs down a makeshift rope that you will very likely remember climbing up as Six in the main game. Despite moving in opposite directions, it seems that your goal is the same. To get off of this godforsaken place. But while Six moves up, the kid moves down. You may notice at some point during this introduction that there's a shackle around the kid's leg. We already know that the kids are trapped here against their will, and this just serves to give us another horrible reminder of that. The kid doesn't ever really seem to acknowledge it, though. He's gotten used to it, it would seem. Eventually, we encounter a flashlight on the ground in a room filled with black leeches, and we stop seeing the girl after this point, so it seems pretty likely she was killed at some point off screen. Rip flashlight girl. We end up in this place called the Depths. It's a collection of rooms at the very bottom of the maw that seem to have served different purposes initially, but have since flooded and been invaded by a disgusting and strangely aquatic entity that we only see glimpses of as we begin splish-splashing our way through the level. I say invaded, but that's probably the wrong word. The level description says that the entity here has been abandoned to decay and rage, and because of this, I think it's worth returning to a theory from the last video. Whether or not Six is officially the lady's daughter, there's still a lot of evidence to her being next in some kind of line or hierarchy, which was meant to keep the maw running. As mentioned previously, there are pictures in the lady's house which imply she's not the only one of her kind, whatever that might be. Some theorized that Six consuming the lady was representative of her taking over the lady's role or position, and that's why she gains her power at the end. But what if the role has always been gained through force? Further playing reveals that the lady, beneath her mask, is similar in appearance to the beast that lurks in the depths, maybe because they're the same kind of beast. Who, quote-unquote, abandoned this character as the description reads? Well, it's possible that the former Lady of the Maw, after being defeated by the thing that would become the lady we know and love, was not killed, but instead imprisoned deep below the rest of the Maw and its inhabitants, locked away, a prisoner, becoming warped and aggressive by the solitude, hunger, and time. Kind of like mono. Violence is always a cycle. And so we get the granny. Maybe there's another reason she's here, or maybe it's just another one of those instances of the nowhere being the nowhere and putting weird shit in weird places. Whatever the case, the runaway kid learns quickly that there's something in the water, and though he can't initially see exactly what it is, we can assume he's pretty on edge about it all, with the understanding that this place pretty accurately resembles the circumstances of his original nightmare, which doesn't bode well for the intentions of the granny. We do some platforming and puzzle solving to get through this stage, lowering and raising water levels, tricking the granny into going the opposite direction with food, and only swimming for brief periods when it is absolutely necessary. The granny can swim very fast, and if she's near you when you hit the water, you're almost certainly a goner. There's a desperation to the granny, one that becomes clearer as we see more of her revealed. She seems hungry and desperate. She consumes all the food we give her hungrily, and when we try to remove food from her grasp, she clutches onto it with monster truck force for as long as she can. During our attempts to escape the depths, we encounter more mysterious bags and packaging. There's a lot to imply that this place is connected in some way to the kitchen, due to bits of meat and packaging that appear here, some of which being clearly sent down from a higher location. One package we find, suspended high above the water, has a child's arm hanging limply from a tear in the side. It isn't news to us that there are probably a lot of dead kids around, but you might wonder in the back of your head if maybe you've discovered the fate of the flashlight girl. By the time you reach the end of this level, the granny is pissed. She's fully revealed herself a number of times, and in your last moments with her, once she knows you're almost out and free, she tries collapsing the platform you're on with all her might so that you might fall into her grasp, but during her struggle, you can push a powered TV into the water and electrocute her ass. The granny dies, and as you progress towards the next level, it might occur to you that the granny was the first creature you ever encountered on the Maw that didn't seem to serve a specific purpose at all. She's not a customer, she doesn't prepare or move food. Once again, that idea of her being a prisoner lingers. Maybe you did her a service. Maybe she's free now. You don't have much time to linger on the morality of your actions. As quickly after ascending from the depths, you're captured by a familiar figure, and the scene ends. I really do love the way that Gnome Quest manages to thread itself into the main narrative of Little Nightmares. All things considered, the DLC is about as long and varied as the original game, and it actually took me much longer to play because I died a lot. The commitment the team behind the game showed goes above and beyond for the standards set by a lot of other major game studios' DLC practices. That moment in the original game where Six was trapped in a cage and watched a random other kid get dragged away, well, that kid was the kid. I should have planned better for that. We don't see what happens to the kid after he's dragged away, only that he ends up in a sack, being carried from one place to another by a conveyor belt. It's similar to the earlier bundle we saw the child's arm sticking out of, so I'm curious how we managed to avoid being killed during our ensackening, which is, I'm pretty sure, not a word. I'm also curious how we avoid being killed as we remove ourselves from the sack and fall violently into a stack of coal, smashing through a plank of wood on our way down. I guess the wood partially broke our fall. Sweet. We lay there like a Family Guy character for a bit until finally, the game lives up to the fake name I gave it, and we find ourselves surrounded by a bunch of gnomes. Now, our true gnome quest can begin. As you traverse through the next couple of rooms, you realize there are a ton of gnomes down here, like more than you ever encountered at once during Little Nightmares proper. In the original game, they're kind of comparable to rats, not in their actual qualities, but how we see them, scampering from one hidden place to another, usually in groups of only one or two, seemingly both out of their element and perfectly capable of surviving on their own. Down here, though, they are everywhere, and much more sociable. I think it's because the kid doesn't give off crazy dark protagonist energy like Six does, and also that in the next couple of rooms, the kid proves himself much more warm and caring towards the gnomes, rescuing them from various levels of entrapment, some of which appear to be intentional, giving them nice hugs, and throwing them. They seem fine with it. As we gather a group of gnomish homies, or gnomies if you prefer, they begin to help us reach places we couldn't otherwise, move heavy objects together, and just generally provide one of the warmest atmospheres you'll encounter in any of the series. And I'm not saying that because of the furnace, but we should talk about that. There's a big furnace in this stage. It's kind of like the main thing here. That's why there's coal everywhere. It seems like this is where the maw gets its power from, and it seems like the gnomes are the ones responsible for fueling that power. We're not sure why the gnomes are so compelled to fuel the fire, but as you enter the main room, your posse breaks up and all the gnomes start gathering coal and putting it in the furnace. As they do this, a conveyor belt in the background that you could probably ride on moves a little bit, then stops. Clearly, it won't be fully operational unless you get more gnomes. I have to wonder, are the gnomes doing this because they actively want to help you, or is there another reason? Do they have a choice at all? With no way to answer the question, we focus our attention to gathering more workers to fuel the fire. There are a lot more gnomes hidden throughout this stage, and you have to do some real work to get them all back to the furnace, including walking through the pitch dark without— Oh, fuck! It's the janitor again! I honestly think this encounter with the janitor is much more intimidating. One, by how he's swallowed up by the dark, and if you're not looking right at him, you might lose track of him a bit, and two, by how much more unclear your path around him is. He's fumbling out in the open with a level of unpredictability that we didn't see when he was just working or chasing us in the original game. At this point, what he's even doing here is unclear. He might be looking for us, or he might just be hanging out. I think it's easy to assume every action these enemies take are always predatory, but hell, he might be on a break. Either way, getting caught by him is still not optimal, so you gotta juke him out just like always. Eventually, your gnome quest does, unfortunately, come to an end, as you finally gather enough workers that you're able to be carried up and out of the main area to a smaller furnace area, where a number of other gnomes are gathered in front of a smaller furnace. There's something wrong with the shadows they cast as they warm themselves by the fire. They almost look like kids. Huh. Well, no time to ponder on that. We got places to be, like on the top of this elevator where— Oh, shit. Oh, shit. By the way, the achievement you get when this scene ends is called End in Sight, and its description reads, "The final stretch will be largely uneventful," which is really funny because no the fuck it won't. The rest of our playthrough takes place in the residence of the Lady, a character that I luckily don't have to reintroduce you to, because if you've watched this far into this video without watching the first two, that's on you at this point. When we played as 6, we only got a little glimpse of the lady's quarters, a few rooms tucked out of the way, but as the runaway kid, we get to see what I assume is the majority of the rest of this place. It almost seems like a house, but here on the Maw, there are books everywhere, also paintings and sculptures, many of which resemble the lady. There is, once again, an air of elegance here and attached to her that really doesn't appear anywhere else in the game. Before you get to the main area of the DLC, you have to sneak past the lady, the kid hiding in the shadows of the room, and once again, she's standing in front of a broken mirror, a mask clearly on her face. Whoa, this place is huge. The majority of your time in this level will be solving various puzzles to get access to little sculptures that fit into another, larger puzzle you need to solve to progress. The puzzles themselves, while fun, aren't really that important. What is important are a lot of the decorations hanging in this place and the story they tell. For instance, these weird little symbols that are carved into the bottoms of these bookshelves. I've looked at a bunch of different theories for what these symbols represent. The wiki says that 2 of them represent the Maw and the Signal Tower, but that the other 2 have not been revealed. But other people think they might represent characters like the Pretender from Very Little Nightmares, scrapped concepts from Little Nightmares 2 like a TVI monster thing, or even characters from a scrapped physical Little Nightmares comic series that I guess I should talk about really quickly. So, a little while after the first game came out and got popular, a 4-part comic book series for the game was planned, and the first 2 actually got made before the project was cancelled and is now assumed to be non-canon. The reason I don't like bringing it up is because there are historical elements and choices made in the series that directly contradict information we later learn about the world in things like Very Little Nightmares and Little Nightmares 2. For instance, 6 is depicted in a place very similar to the Pale City, except it's filled with inhabitants that much more closely resembled those who come to the Maw, which clearly isn't the case for the city in canon. It also establishes a deeper connection between 6 and certain existing characters, like our favorite character, the bread-giving boy, who is depicted speaking to 6, which I just don't love. I think the way it was portrayed in game is better and more mysterious. The reason I'm bringing it up at all is because, while I don't think it's a valuable source of official lore, I'd be willing to bet that some of the concepts included within are still relevant to the Little Nightmares universe, and I'd even go so far as to bet that they'll be, at least partially, the focus of the upcoming third entry. The 3 primary concepts I want to mention are all different entities, 2 of which were only encountered by other children. Those 2 are called the North Wind and the Mirror Monster. The North Wind is a shrouded character that we barely are able to see, who apparently goes from town to town, destroying them in a ravenous mission to slaughter every child that he can find. As his name would imply, he carries with him a strong and powerful wind that destroys most things it touches. The Mirror Monster is also bad news for kids. He seems to only live in mirrors, and the special funky way that he kills kids is by luring them to his mirrors with visions of their wildest dreams. And then, when they're close enough, he reveals himself to be a tentacle-headed beast who grabs his victim with his haired tentacle things and brings them into the mirror. The Ferryman. He's this big, hulking figure with a dirty jacket and a strange, drooping face. As far as we know, he's the one who brings children to the Maw, which is obviously scary in what it represents, but the way the series treats him, the way he seems to remove himself from the standard that most inhabitants of this world comply with, how he almost seems calm. Though we haven't encountered this character physically in any game, the idea that he might be more relevant than the actual games are implying might start to appear in the back of our mind. But there's not much we can do with these ideas right now, so let's finish going through the DLC first. There are lots of minor secrets and theories attached to them in here, so I'm going to do a lightning round real quick. There are a number of life-size geisha statues throughout the residence of the lady, all of which mostly resembling the lady herself. However, one of them appears to be headless. Some theorize that this geisha represents the former lady of the Maw, and that the current one broke her head off because she couldn't stand looking at the form. Maybe this was the entity that would go on to become the granny? Speaking of headless statues, you can find 8 headless little girls scattered throughout the stage. These could represent any number of people, potentially the lady and siblings, or at least other potential ladies when they were younger. Former successors to the position of the lady? We don't know why their heads are all gone. There are a number of paintings that seem to represent characters from Little Nightmares 2, including the teacher, porcelain children, and there's even this hallway where you're surrounded by pictures of eyes, kind of like the interior of the signal tower. You can also find this insane painting if you go out of your way to solve a book puzzle, and truly, I have no idea what exactly it's supposed to represent. The achievement you get when you find it is called Ashes to Ashes, and there's an element of flame or burning to the design, so it probably has to represent one of those somehow. I think maybe it could have to do with the gnomes down powering the furnace. I don't think there's an answer for this, but maybe the painting is meant to represent their torment to some degree or another. I also found a theory saying that maybe the lady had children at some point, which she killed or burned. I don't know. You tell me what you think. Anyway, the final bits of exploring this place are very creepy. These little shadow puppet kids begin popping up all around you, first passively out of the corner of your eye, but then aggressively, attempting to dive bomb you and kill you for some reason. However, you've got a pretty good defense, and these little dudes are sensitive to light and will be fully destroyed if kept under your flashlight for a couple seconds. With their white masks and their aversion to being seen, they almost feel like little versions of the lady. Speaking of which, as we move forward and finally away from these guys, we see the lady down a hallway, looking at herself in the mirror, only this time she's maskless, and the mirror appears to be unbroken. Finally, we get a good look at her real... Ew. The lady does not like that we have seen her, and she makes that very clear, screaming at us and chasing us like a madwoman. However, this time we can't beat her, and obviously, 6 is the one who beats her, later in the timeline, I guess, and so now as we flee, I can't help but think, am I going to get out? No. Because eventually, the lady catches you, surprising you from the darkness and holding you in place, shadows flowing around you and through you, crushing you, condensing you, until finally, oh my god, we're a gnome. The gnomes are kids! See? That's why they cast those shadows, that's why they're so happy to help you. They're kids, probably ones who also got caught trying to escape. Lady wastes nothing, so it would seem. If you're not food, you're a worker, keeping the lanterns lit so your more passive brethren can be chopped up and served. No one escapes, no one except... No, I remember this room. No, I remember that sausage. No! I love this ending. It's so perfect for the series, I think, and it makes Six look even worse to us, taking her from being a gray protagonist and making her a full-on villain, at least in the context of us playing as the kid. By the way, there's that other theory about why Six eats us that I mentioned earlier, and I'll bring it up now. If you remember the ending of Little Nightmares 2, after Six is stolen away by the Thin Man, she leaves behind a shadowy version of herself, the same that we see in the secret ending of that game, leading her to the Maw. Whatever has been separated from Six has remained separated from her. Maybe it's her conscience or her morality, or just a section of her that is less definable, but whatever the case, Six continues throughout the rest of her story without it. Except that's not really true. Every time Six eats in the first game, we see the shadow. Usually it's hidden, or at least out of the way, but it's always there, watching passively as Six becomes hungrier and hungrier and acts more and more violently. Maybe the shadow is driving Six to this hunger. Maybe the fact that she's separated from it is what's driving her. Either way, though, there seems to be a duality here, represented by two physical pieces of Six appearing at once but separately. Interestingly, while we can pretty easily guess what they both represent in unity, that being duality, it's much harder to decide which piece of them represents what. If you broke your personality in half, would you know which part of you is which? And that's probably why Six drops Mono, because she's lost something. Maybe her memory, maybe her humanity, maybe her ability to empathize. We don't know, but something is missing. See, if you haven't picked up on this yet, pretty much every piece of Little Nightmares fiction really serves the grand purpose of illustrating that the only way to survive in the nowhere is to be a monster. Little Nightmares 2, as mentioned earlier in this series, is about survival versus heroics, and through Mono's eyes, proves to us that being a hero only gets you into more trouble. Very Little Nightmares teaches us that it's safer to be removed from the struggle of others, and only to help when it might benefit us. And of course, Little Nightmares proper tells us that the only way to beat the big guy is to become like him, to kill without remorse, and we learn that like 3 different times in that game. So what does Gnome Quest, or to be serious for a moment, the secrets of the Maw, teach us about the nowhere? Simple. There is no room for warmth here. Even the physical warmth of the fireplace represents something dark, the enslavement of these children, the cold that must exist so palpably everywhere else in this place that everyone feels the need to gather here near its blaze. The other kids you encounter are uninterested in your struggles. Helping the gnomes as the kid just gets you turned into one of them. Trying to feed a starving Six just gets you killed. In most of these situations, I wouldn't call the kid's actions heroics in the same way I would for Mono. Mono was being an action star, killing enemies and diving towards danger. The kid was just trying to be kind. You can see that in his hugs, in the way that the gnomes treat him versus Six, and in that final action he takes before he's eaten. The kid, in my opinion, is probably the most gentle character in the series, despite still killing enemies himself. It really can't be avoided here. And now, finally, shockingly, we've covered every single existing piece of canonical visual Little Nightmares media, and we finally understand the truth behind the nowhere, which is obviously, I mean, if you take it all in and really, well, see, because of the signal tower, and well, Six is really the most, God damn it, why am I still so confused by the nowhere? Why doesn't it make sense? Why don't I understand the rules? Still feels like a mystery, like a suggestion of something more important, like a goddamn bad dream about... Is it a dream? Before we finish this video, and by extension this series, at least for now, we have to talk about the final and most recent actual entry into the universe of Little Nightmares. But before we do, I actually have a personal note I'd like to make. I started playing Little Nightmares right at the beginning of high school, and that was a weird time for me. I was changing as a person, from a kid into the first concepts of an adult I would go on to become, and as I'm sure many of you can relate to, it was a painful transition. The people I'd grown up with were changing, just like me, and all became a bit more different and separate. I started going to a new school. I started dealing with a more serious version of depression and anxiety. I didn't know what I was going to do with myself in both the short term and the long term. It was hard, and yet not unique. Being a kid is really scary. And there was something about that first game and that little girl in the raincoat that I understood, even if I couldn't point it out at the time. That feeling of constantly needing to hide or run or become something scarier or harsher to save myself from the nightmares I was encountering on a regular basis. It was familiar in, of course, a surreal and warped kind of way, but those words described most of my reality, at the time at least. When Little Nightmares 2 came out, I was about to graduate. I had figured a lot of my shit out by then, but new shit has a way of popping up just when you feel you're in control. Either way, though, I was back. I was back in this world, dealing with these monsters, suddenly on a larger scale and in an environment that was more palpably adult. And was that what it was going to feel like when I finally graduated and left home? Would it be like entering the Pale City? Would I find myself in an endless cycle of effort and failure, all in pursuit of a goal I might never actually reach? Why am I playing games? Why am I acting? Why am I writing? Does any of this matter? Will any of it help me? And then I'm 19, and then 20, then 21. Not much of an adult in the grand scheme of things, but definitely not a kid anymore. I attend college for years. I decide to stop. I live on my own. I have relationships and breakups. I accrue debt and pay it off, then accrue more. My life doesn't become one cycle, it becomes made of many, all spinning around me in a constant rotation of chaos that I try to claim as routine, and despite, or maybe just because of that, I find a realer version of myself. I start writing again. I start writing a lot. I start being more critical of the things I love, and that leads me to more things I love. I start posting. The things I love start being worth something again. I start being successful, and then Little Nightmares 3 is announced. I play the first 2 games again. I remember being a kid. I think of being an adult now. I think how lucky I am to have made it. I think of how much I miss being a kid. I think of how much I hated being a kid. I think the same things about being an adult. I think about the nowhere. I think about the real world. I think I understand. I don't think it's possible to. I think it's all a dream. I think it's undeniably reality. I think I think too much. I think I want too much. I think we all do. I think Little Nightmares is about all of us. I think Little Nightmares is about humanity. I think that's why I love it. I think that's probably why all of you do too. And now, I think we should talk about the podcast. The Sounds of Nightmares is the most grounded Little Nightmares entry we get, whatever that means, and there's only 6 episodes. I'm not even going to point that one out. If you haven't noticed it, there's almost certainly no way you've been paying attention to the series. Happy to be your background noise, though. Hope your drawing or knitting or whatever is going well. The reason I call it the most grounded is because, as far as I can tell, the majority of it actually takes place in our universe, in the reality that you and I are sitting in right now. What is so fascinating about this reveal is that it proves that not only is the nowhere a separate and distinct place from reality, it also means that we should be considering our own reality as a part of the Little Nightmares canon, as another potential explanation for what's going on or where people are coming from. One question that's managed to evade the majority of this analysis is, where are the kids coming from? The presence of this ferryman character, who we know very little about going into the podcast, implies that they have to be being brought from somewhere else, but is it somewhere else in the nowhere, or is it somewhere out here? And if it is out here, referring to the real world, where is it? Can it be accessed by anyone? Can it be returned from? That's kind of the question that the entire podcast seems to be about. The series includes 2 main speaking characters, one of which being that counselor that I mentioned in the first video, the other of which being a character called Noon, spelled specifically the way it appears on screen, which is important because if you separate the name between the O's, it becomes No One, a name that potentially holds huge ramifications in the face of a location called the Nowhere. See, Noon has been placed under the psychiatric care of a counselor named Otto. And yes, I should clarify, since I made a point of it in the first video, the counselor does have a real name and isn't just the counselor. However, we've already gone down a bit of a rabbit hole on duality, so the fact that he has both shouldn't be a game changer for us. In fact, it should help solidify this growing idea that there's a mixture of elements in us, a bit of good and bad. The only question is, which part is stronger? Throughout the course of the podcast, Otto is treating Noon for two separate things, one officially and the other privately. Officially, he's here to treat Noon, who appears to be having delusions of sickness, specifically claiming she has something called water sickness, which Otto strongly implies she does not. I'm inclined to believe Otto in this case, but not because he's particularly trustworthy. The other thing he's investigating has to do with nightmares. That should ring some bells for anyone who simply knows the name of the podcast or anything past that. Apparently, someone he cares about, someone called Cece, has gone missing, and her disappearance has something to do with dreams. Noon, in sessions with her counselor, will recount a number of dreams she has where she's dropped into strange and horrifying sections of a place that all appears to be one massive world, the nowhere. Every time Noon goes to sleep, she wakes up somewhere else in the nowhere. Now, the counselor seems familiar with elements of Noon's story, likely from this undisclosed connection to the character of Cece, who we understand to have been capable of a similar sort of dream walking through context clues and later confirmation. But we don't know any Cece. She's never described, never pictured in game, never even mentioned. But something interesting I've noticed about Noon's description of the world, of the things and people she encounters there, is that a lot of them seem to be kids, and most of them seem to have titles instead of names, like Jester or the child with the gooey hair. It's like whatever you were in the real world, which is where I imagine a number of these kids came from originally, goes away in the nowhere, and you're reduced to whatever you are, kind of like being referred to as only a janitor, or a chef, or a teacher. Simple titles, simple ideas, twisted. It really is like the nowhere is just one big nightmare. Throughout all of her explanations, Noon keeps mentioning this thing called the Candleman. He's this big, hulking figure with a dirty jacket and a strange, drooping face. He's the ferryman. Noon's been seeing the ferryman, and not only that, it seems like the ferryman has seen Noon, as well as Cece, but why? What is happening? Why is any of this relevant? Is it just meant to confuse us more? No, it's not. The point of this podcast is actually shockingly simple. It's to explain two things: how to get to the nowhere and where 6 came from. There's a scene in the podcast where Noon describes coming across a yellow raincoat among a pile of other clothes. Upon hearing this, the counselor reacts dramatically, questioning her frantically if anyone else was there, and though he doesn't say it out loud, anyone who's played the games should know why this raincoat is so important, why it's so iconic, why Otto is so terrified when he realizes it's there unattended. It was Cece's, which can only mean one of two things: that Cece is the character we played as in Very Little Nightmares, or that Cece is 6, her name stripped away just like everything else in this world. Obviously, at first it makes more sense for her to be from Very Little Nightmares, but don't forget, the nowhere is a world of dreams, and by extension, dream logic. Maybe, when 6 picked up the raincoat, it wasn't just because she was cold and in the rain, but because she recognized it from her real life, her original life with Otto. There is an invisible force moving through all these games, be it the signal tower or the lady or fate or something else, but what if that same force, that same spirit of mystery, led 6 back to the part of her personality she thought she had lost and would maybe even go on to lose again? Otto forces Noon to go further and further into these dramatic dreams with such fervor and intensity that we quickly grow to distrust and dislike Otto. He, like all the adults in the nowhere, is just using children as tools, an idea he vocalizes a distaste for by the beginning of the story, but falls into just the same by the end, putting Noon, a girl who has real connections and family in the real world, at incredible risk by forcing her into a confrontation with this Candleman, or Ferryman, or whatever you want to call him, and he loses her. The Sounds of Nightmares is really a story about two manipulators in a struggle to gain control over Noon. Otto, so he can find his sister, Cece, and the Candleman, so he can bring Noon permanently into his world. And the Candleman wins! He convinces Noon that her water sickness, a sickness I'm still not convinced ever existed in her, won't hurt her in the nowhere, and because Otto has failed so grandly at doing his actual job, which is taking care of a child, which is what every adult monster fails to do in this series, another child is lost to the horrific world of the nowhere. And Otto makes up his mind to try again. Violence is always a cycle. Adults are monsters. Kids have to fight to survive, and violence is always a cycle where adults are monsters and kids have to fight them to survive, and the violence becomes a cycle where these kids grow into adults who are monsters, and their victims are kids who have to fight to survive with a violence that is always, always a cycle. The entirety of the series of Little Nightmares holds a mirror up to humanity and says, Look at what you've done. Look at how you've scared your kids. Look at the world you've created and how it perpetuates itself and how it will continue to long after you're gone, and how the people you've hurt within it will only continue to hurt until that hurt spills out and the cycle continues. Little Nightmares takes place in a dream, but it's about reality. And maybe that's why Little Nightmares 3 seems to be about a mirror. It could be a reference to that mirror monster character we talked about earlier, just as the rest of the trailer could be showing the damage dealt by the North Wind, but even if that is the case, a mirror always means something. It just does. Maybe we've reached a breaking point where it's no longer possible to hide from ourselves with masks or darkness. Maybe it's time to acknowledge the truth about ourselves. That we are all terrible. But we don't have to be.